This is the second part where we're talking about Lemuria. And we're going to look at Lemuria one more time, and we might shoot through Atlantis in one talk. And there's not much to talk about in Atlantis anyway. No. All right. Commitment. We need to talk about commitment. And in action is where we find commitment. In action we put ourselves. We can't act or we can't do something without being in it. And if we don't put ourselves in it, it always spells trouble. Like in athletics, the person who tries the maneuver and doesn't try it wholeheartedly is the person that's likely to injure themselves. The whole principle of action and commitment in action is in the Orient called karma. And it is that which results from action. That by committing yourself to a given type of experience, by acting, by doing, you gain experience. And basically that is what we're talking about. We're talking about living in experiences. But when we commit ourselves or when we act, this is something that is changeable. There are all sorts of folk statements that talk about this. I can't think of a good one offhand, sort of like the idea, as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. Meaning to say that at the start of an action or at the start of a life or a growth pattern, the way something is done determines the way the action is going to be in the future. So what we're saying is, not only do we put ourselves in our action, and not only do we commit ourselves in action, but when we do so, there is a responsibility. We're responsible for what comes out of our actions and the way they grow. And that's one of the principles that we're going to talk about, because what we have to talk about is very difficult stuff to talk about tonight. But in doing it, I'm trying to bring out some principles. The way and the time that action is initiated indicates quite a great deal of how the outcome is going to be. To a large extent, you might say the initial action is more important than any other part of the action. It's true that if you're swinging a baseball bat or something like that, the second half of the swing is as important as the first half, but the way you start and when you start, those are very important ingredients. Because a lot of, if you start out of time, there's no way you can hit the ball. It'll be past you before you got the bat halfway around. And so the idea that we're looking at is when in a stream of consequences or in a stream of actions, because we're always in action, when we initiate something new, what is the responsibility or what are the things to take care of at that time in the whole business? And you can understand that the way, what kind of an action is started is going to have all sorts of consequences, and they cascade and they fan out from one initial action. You might say, again with another old phrase, that you don't get grapes from a thorn. And therefore, if you start an action that has a pleasant intent and is harmonious with its intent, that's what you're going to get. But if you look at some actions, probably the most graphic one that I can think of anywhere in literature is Macbeth. Macbeth decides he wants to be King of Scotland after it has been prophesied to him by 3 old hags, and his wife eggs him on to murder the current King of Scotland, and then he will then become king. And what happens is it's a succession, a domino, that's all right, it's not going to bother me. It's a domino succession of murders, that the first murder necessitates more and more and more murders. That one follows after another, and it becomes very, they become necessary. The same thing happens with lies. Mark Twain says, with great wit, he says, if you're going to be a liar, you better have a good memory. Because one lie begets another lie, because you have to cover up, or you have to elaborate, or you have to cover some kind of contingency. And so there is that sort of thing. The one that is somewhat pertinent to what we're talking about tonight is the original so-called disobedience of Adam and Eve in what is called the Garden of Eden. The way it is described, or at least the way it is suggested in our Bible, is that the sin of Adam and Eve was the sin of disobedience. And their disobedience in the next generation leads to Cain, who is a murderer. It's like saying that going against things at one time leads to a deeper kind of sin further on down the line. So, what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand a principle of when and how to initiate activity, and if we misinitiate activity, what comes out of it. And the most common example is a topic that is not a pleasant one to deal with, but personally, I have no use in any way for any form of abortion. I find myself in unusual political grounds because most of the rest of the politics of the so-called pro-life movement is not pro-life because they're in favor of war, but I can't see a justified reason for an abortion. And one of the reasons that I can't is because that is not the time to alter the course of things. What is being said is that destiny and nature have already set something into motion, and you don't thwart destiny very easily. You don't buck against nature very easily without causing all sorts of difficulties. However, I do feel better about birth control, because going backwards in the chain of consequences, if you're working with birth control, what you have done is you have denied a kind of activity to get started, but at least you haven't terminated, you haven't frustrated a creative process that is already going. You haven't made it difficult for somebody who is struggling to come to incarnation. On the other hand, if one is more antecedent yet in the chain of causes, I guess I feel better about self-control even over birth control. Are you going to need hot water, Suzanne? No, I have to flip the switch if you're going to need hot water. Okay. Hi, Willie. This is going to be a strange tape. Willie gets my attention. So I think self-control, that is deliberating action or inaction, is even better than having a compromise of your action in terms of birth control. It's very difficult, sometimes seemingly impossible. And I guess I feel even better yet about if one can not only be self-controlled, but if one can understand transcendentally purpose, and that if actions issue out of purpose rather than issuing out of just the need for action. And I think that's something that even transcends self-control. If you look in the zodiac, the ninth house in Sagittarius are the sign of purpose. And then the sign of karma follows after that. That is to say that action, controlled, deliberate action, has to issue out of purpose. So I think you get the whole idea that I'm talking about, that when an action is initiated and how it is initiated determines a whole course of things. And that to try and change an action when it's already been initiated is a difficult thing. Okay. Now we have to look at some things that I have to give a few warnings about. We're going to be talking about dark subjects tonight. We're going to be talking about subjects like sin and evil and what is called the fall of humanity. And it's always easy when doing that to get lost in a world of darkness. And I have to state beforehand that even though we're going to examine dark things, the light always precedes and always succeeds darkness. So that the origin of things and the end of things is light. Another thing is that in absolute, in the larger sense, there really is no such thing as evil. Evil, as we see it, or as we experience it, or as we understand it, is only relevant. It's only something that is present in a transitional state, and good will come out of it. So even though we're talking about something that is very, when you think of all the starvation that's going on, and when you think of all of the out-and-out nastiness that people are manifesting in the world, it's foolish to say that there aren't evil thoughts and attitudes, but it's even more foolish to think that those things are eternal and that those things will continue to bother us forever and ever. And the final thing is, after the fact that light always precedes and succeeds darkness, that evil is always ephemeral and relative in the cosmic evolutionary sense, the final thing that I can say is that there is no ultimate rationale for evil. After having spent year after year after year trying to understand it, I can understand the psychology of how one gets into the consciousness of one who identifies by sin, who identifies by evil. But ultimately there is no rationale for evil. It is stupid. You can look at it deeper and deeper and deeper, and always your intuitive sense comes to say, this is stupid. And it can't be any other way but the fact that evil is stupid. All right. We left off last time talking about how Lemurian humanity had work to do. It's again the same principle that we've been discussing all along, that at any time in evolution there is no unnecessary part. There is no non-functional being anywhere in the cosmos. It's like the Chinese state that if heaven can create it, earth has a use for it. And we've been talking about the service that we as evolving beings have had all along. And we mentioned that in Lemurian consciousness, in that period of time that we call Lemuria, in our evolution, we still had the creative power of the word, and we were used as vehicles for issuing words from ourselves, and by that we were creating the forms that precipitated as the bodies for various types of animal species. The Bible calls it naming the animals. The Hindu texts call it something very, very similar. And the whole idea is that we were getting out of ourselves, by a recapitulation, all of those moods that we had experienced when we were in the animal-like state back in the earlier stage of evolution called the moon period. And as we got them out of us, this is really, the Freudians would be envious of this. As we got them out of us, as we spoke them out of us, they became forms. And other beings moved into those forms and lived them. In short, we are part of the creative activity. Our evolution, our creative thinking, and ourselves as vehicles for the divine plan are the means whereby evolution takes place. We also mentioned that at this same period we were condensing into matter. We were coming from a very ethereal state, and we and the earth were both becoming solid. We had just been thrown off within this gigantic whirling mass of energy that was the entire solar system, the entire sun, and as we were thrown off, we were cooling, and we were condensing as individuals. The globe of the earth was condensing, and because things were becoming externalized, and were becoming externalized to a degree of finality, we became so solidified that we could no longer carry on as we had in the inner worlds. In the inner worlds, we were able to maintain a continuous form, either that or drop off one form and migrate into another without cessation of life or consciousness. But as we came into the deeper, harder earth, we couldn't do that anymore. And so then what we did is what is called the separation of the sexes. Part of our energy was turned outward to produce bodies through the procreative process, and part of our energy was turned inward to build organs and to do spiritual work. All right. So we found then ourselves in a state of cooperation, which is really important because the philosophy goes right along with what's happening in the world. When we were deep in the spiritual worlds, in the much earlier parts of evolution, there weren't all of these complications. There weren't all of these ramifications, all of these details, all of these different kinds of form. It's only when things become very externalized and very materialized that this kind of intricacy can take place at all. So the spiritual philosophy was different then. But if you think of the idea of the separation of the sexes, it brings in a whole different kind of philosophy. It brings about a voluntary, necessary external cooperation by standalone individuals. It is perfectly possible to go through life as an individual and never cooperate with anyone else for the good of somebody else to come in and be born. It's possible to do that. But when you do that, then you move away from the very important philosophy of the times. You know, like basically if you look at it in terms of plant evolution, if you look at the early plants in evolution, it's like the conifers. The conifers do not need animals to procreate. In fact, often they don't even need other conifers to procreate. They can just have the pollen be wind-borne, and they can self-pollinate. And they are then standalone, you know, no matter what the season is like, whether the bees are out that year or not, they can still pollinate, still go on. In the most rugged places in the world, they can go on and they can exist. It's a standalone kind of consciousness, but it is a lonely, solitary type of consciousness. If you look, at the other hand, at bringing in bees and other insects, and in some cases even birds, you have to depend on the other beings to do the pollination. But when you enter into that world of cooperation and compare the number of plants that are pollinated by animals versus those that are self-pollinated or wind-pollinated, the variety and the vastness and all the different kinds of experiences that are in the plant kingdom are multiplied again and again and again. And the same sort of philosophy came to human beings. We were able to differentiate. We were able to have all different sorts of varieties of experience because we were willing to cooperate with agencies outside of ourselves. And the principle of cooperation versus, you know, it's like saying in the cosmic mandala, the whole universal half of life that is symbolized by the second half of the mandala is kicked off by the sign and house of cooperation. And that cooperation is the road to universality, the way to expand into more and more vehicles rather than just being a personal type of individual. Okay. So then, because we had this division between internality and externality, and because our self-consciousness was very weak and only just beginning to dawn, and we were only just beginning to be near to thinking and just beginning to be near to freedom, and because we were sinking deep into matter and were very far isolated from the central cause of all evolution, this put us in a very tenuous and vulnerable place. It's sort of like if you go to a new place to live and you're vulnerable. I've had it happen that I start hanging around with people that I would never normally hang around with when coming to a new place because I'm vulnerable. I don't know where the people are that, you know, and so you get into ruts, and sometimes you get into yourself into very bad habits. And sort of this is where we were. We were removed from quite a bit of spiritual insight because of our focus into matter, and we were vulnerable. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to point to the similarity between this and, let's say, a moment of temptation sexually. There is a vulnerability there. It almost always happens at a time when you seem to be weakened and all of the other opportunities seem to be very glamorous to you, and you're vulnerable. And going back to the unpleasant example that we used of a stream of actions, we were talking about sexuality versus birth control versus abortion, and we were in this period in Lemuria, we were at one of those vulnerable times. And all right, we've looked at the vulnerability. All right, we're going along all right. So this was a really critical time. Now, if you remember way back He likes the fact that that's recorded forever and ever. He says, I'm going to spot edit these. I think it's great. I think it's one of the best talks we've had all year. If you remember, this type of circumstance is analogous to when we first were immersed into matter at the very beginning of the solar cosmos. If you remember way back then in the Saturn period, when the gods were speaking words to us and that they were impregnating their being into us, and that their being has now become like organs in our body, and the principles that are behind the organs in our body, all of those things were emanated into us. All of everything that we're going to become in the cosmos was spoken into us by the gods in the earlier stages. But some of us did not take it, and we echoed it back. And we speculated, because we could only speculate because it's so deep and so very hard to understand, that the reason why we echoed that back and were not receptive was because we were clinging to the bliss in a proto-memory of the way things were before the beginning of the evolution. And that the clinging to that blissful state kept us from actually doing what we were doing in the beginning of the cosmic work that we were part of. And that caused people, or that caused beings in evolution to straggle, and they couldn't keep up with the plan, because like the whole creation, it's like a piece of music or like a dance work or something like that. There is an internal rhythm to it. And by not staying with the timing and the internal rhythm, we straggled and we produced a creative form in ourselves and in the cosmos that wasn't quite right. Now, we have to look at this again. We have to look back again. We're still at Lemuria, and we're talking about our vulnerability in Lemuria, just when we're beginning to be creators and just beginning to come into the earth. And we had influences. And in order to understand these influences, we've got to go back to something else. Remember, I said we always keep adding complications as we go on. So let's go back. We said that the early period when we were mineral-like was called Saturn. And then the next period of time, these we can't even talk about years, because the measurement of time in terms of the movement of bodies through space was not something that was considered in those parts of evolution. It's just different. It was a matter of consciousness. And then we went through what was called the Sun period, and in the Sun period we recapitulated a plant-like state. And then we went through the Moon period, where we recapitulated where we actually initiated, I shouldn't say recapitulated, where we initiated an animal-like state. And mind you now, like the whole cosmos was expanding and contracting and going through different levels of depth, such that when we were mineral-like, we were no more solid than a thought is, which is quite something to say that we were thought human beings, and that when we were thought minerals, and that when we were plant-like, we were no more dense than a desire, and when we were animal-like, we were no more dense than an action, or the energy that goes through an action. And there are all of these conditions revolving and twisting in on each other, and evolution is very, very complex. We've only looked at a few of the parts of it. And now finally, we are at what is called a period of time called the Earth. And we're actually in the middle of this vast period of time when the solar system becomes manifest within the whole creative solar cosmos. But back in the Moon period, remember, we've always talked about different beings phased off at different stages of evolution. When we were animal-like, there were different beings that were human-like in this Moon period. in that far-off time. And the beings that are now angels were then human-like. That is to say, the angelic stage of existence succeeds the human-like state of existence. If you remember, in this moon period, this is part of the creation which is talked about in one very brief sentence in the Bible where it says, and the waters were divided from the waters. We said that first there was a cosmic warmth, and it was a cosmic warmth of thought. And then there was a light, and that was a light that was what some people would call an astral light, a light of desire. And then there was a life, and that life or that form or that, I don't know how you'd say it, a living vapor. The cosmos, so it's like saying that this is also in the Bible. If you look, I believe it's in 1 Peter, where it talks, the whole nebular development of the cosmos is also described in about 2 sentences, saying that first there was a heat, and then the heat became light, and out of the heat there became a vapor, just like when you burn now, there's water vapor that is released. And in this vapor there was a circulation. And we lived suspended as animal-like beings in this vapor. Well, the human-like beings that are now angels were also associated with this flowing back and forth, like the whole solar cosmos was basically a warm, indistinct ball, and something like a more solid, but definitely not solid, satellite that went around that ball, and there were like currents of vapor such that the vapor became hot near the surface of the ball or within the ball, and then the vapor was driven outward where it cooled and then it came back again. And part of our experience was experiencing the life of this movement. And our whole understanding, like of what we call nervous fluids in our body, what some people call pranic energy, or the flow of energy through our being, was learned and experienced in this condition in the old moon period. Now, the angel being, the human beings of that time that are now the angels, or at least part of them are, also had their vulnerabilities. Just take it all as a story, John. It's a wild out story. This is something. These tales go way back to seers back in Egypt and India and places like that. And this used to be sung like poetry, and people would still have inner visions, and they would collect their vision and see it in a form of like initiation. But some of these then human-like beings, as they wakened their consciousness, came to like some conditions better than others. And they liked the brighter light, and they liked the warmth of being near this central source of heat and light. So much so that it would almost be like they just reveled in that. And it isn't that they they disliked other experiences, but they had a preference for the excitement of this kind of life, so that they stayed there. And as a consequence, they unfitted their evolution. Now, the way it works is that the consciousness of angels now, because of the experience that they had, they developed a polar consciousness. I should say a bipolar consciousness. And it's like an electric circuit. An electric circuit won't flow, and it won't accomplish something unless there is a flow of energy from the positive to the negative pole. So you have to have the bipolar attachment in order to have a flow. And that bipolar experience was gained from the heat and the cold. This is really simplifying it. And from the extremely vital life versus the extremely formative vital life. And so the angels, by developing that bipolar consciousness, when they were human-like, they developed a totally different consciousness than we have. They just have wisdom flows through them. They can focus on the divine images, the divine creative archetypes in a receptive way, and they can love in a positive way, so that they have both a statement and an assertion, and at the same time a receptivity. And because of that, cosmic wisdom flows through them unimpeded. It just flows. On the other hand, the brightest of the angels, who loved all of that brightness, who loved all of that warmth, they had a difficulty because they did not develop a bipolar kind of thing. They became one-sided in their development. And as a consequence, they straggled. And these beings that straggled when the angels were human-like were given a special name. And they're called Lucifers, or Lucifer spirits. All right. So they found themselves in a particular fix. Oh, we're not that far down yet. All right. I haven't outstripped my notes. So after the moon period, everything went to sleep again, as it always does in the great cosmic night. And then things started coming out and congealing into what we've been talking about for the last 3 meetings. And we're now talking specifically about humanity on Earth and how the Earth is encrusting after having been very fluid, made out of a fluid of energy stuff. Now, this is the position that the Lucifers find themselves in. They cannot do the work of angels because they didn't develop the innocent flow quality. They were too one-sided. On the other hand, they advanced quite far, and they just couldn't be destroyed because even though they weren't particularly cooperative, in fact they were called rebellious, they weren't particularly cooperative, they obviously couldn't be destroyed. That was, you can't destroy part of creation, because if you destroy part of creation, you're destroying yourself. Talking about from the viewpoint of the gods, the same thing is true. On the other hand, we've talked all along about how stragglers can catch up in the next run of things by staying back. It's sort of like in when you're in grade school. You stay back a grade. If you didn't learn enough, you stay back and then you learn it, and you're a little bit ahead of the other kids, but you're behind the group that you were intended to be with. And so the Lucifers found themselves in that kind of position, but they couldn't become human beings. The reason being is they had no experience with matter of this kind. They didn't know anything about solid stuff. And so they were in a fix, and they were left to fend for themselves. And that's where things come up. They needed experience. They didn't have a vehicle for experience that they could continue to go on. So therefore they fended for themselves and they found vulnerable beings. Which vulnerable beings were us. We described all the vulnerabilities. We weren't really strong in the spirit yet, and we certainly weren't solid in matter, and we were distant from the spiritual consciousness, and therefore we were very vulnerable. And so what the Lucifers said, well, if we can influence these people, or if we can influence these beings to gain experience in a way that is compatible to us, and keep them from being too harmonious with the rest of the cosmos, then we have a constant source of experience for ourselves. And this is what is called the Great Temptation, or it's called the fall of humanity. And so, what they attempted to do is distract us from our source of guidance. And at this time, our sources, it's I don't know how to say this. We're all in this together. And it's like seeing a play by a company that has very few people. That everybody has to play all kinds of different roles. And in playing all of those different roles, they come back. There are examples of this, like in terms of reincarnation. The Germans were at one time the Greeks. And the British were at one time the Romans. But in between there, the Greeks were the Carthaginians. And the Romans fought with the Carthaginians. But going way back, the Greeks fought against the Trojans. So the Trojans lost that one, but then they come back as Romans and they beat the Carthaginians, and then they come back as, I'm just speaking in rough terms now. It's not saying that everyone that is British was at one time Roman or Trojan, but it's sort of like you come back, like the same people that are in your family, you've probably been with them numerous times before in different types of relationships. You may have been the parent, I may have been Willie's brother, or something like that. And so now the circumstance is, oh, poor guy. My pride won't let me say a squawk now. So the angels are our guides. They are the ones, literally, as in some cases, as guardian angels. The situation being that even though we are individuals and responsible for our own acts by action, by the law of action, by karma, we are still needing help. And so we have these angels that guide us. And the angels are not only associated with the old moon period, they're actually associated with the moon that circulates around the earth. Ooh. They're actually associated with the moon that circulates around the earth. And from that distance, they do their work of helping us build bodies and guide us. And so like when the sexes were first separated, we were at various times when it was harmonious with the forces in the cosmos, we were guided in what were called honeymoons. And we were mated by being influenced to come together and procreate at those times. So what the Lucifers did is they decided to enter in to this process, and they didn't want the wisdom that flows right through the angels. They wanted something else. They wanted because knowledge is something much more distinct it was like that experience of being warm and bright and such in the moon period when they were near the central source. And so they wanted a distinct, clear knowledge which was closer to their kind of evolution. And so they felt that if they could attract us away from the influence of the angels, they could get us going down a path of knowledge rather than the path of wisdom. And this is described in the Bible remember in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is clearly a statement of clairvoyance. We still had spiritual sight. There were 4 rivers that flowed in, 4 etheric streams that flowed into our consciousness and gave us an internal clairvoyant kind of experience. And the expulsion from the Garden of Eden means the loss of clairvoyance. Paul, in the opening chapter of Romans, the first of the Pauline works in the Bible, says this very clearly, that at one time we could see right to the very Godhead itself, and it was because of sexual perversion, that is, turning away the energy from that source, that we lost it all, and that we have come deeper and deeper down into earth. So, what we're talking about then is the Garden of Eden story. There were 2 trees, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. We were forbidden to eat the fruits of this tree. Okay, so this is what the Lucifers did. They went for the jugular. They immediately went to the most central... How did that happen? You got a stronger remote control than you ever thought. They went to the most central, the most powerful force available to human beings. From a spiritual point of view, the internal essence, not necessarily just the physical activity, but the internal essence that is used in sexuality is what creates, maintains, transforms, and dissolves the entire cosmos. Because this goes all the way back to what we talked about in the beginning. We are microcosms. We are exact replicas of the cosmos. And at the heart of our being, we have a touch with the same creative source that creates the cosmos. And this is associated with, in part, with sexuality, with all creativity. This is not a religious doctrine. This is, from the mystical point of view, it is scientific fact. The mystics of all times and all ages, by experiment, because that's what happens when you start dealing with knowledge, you learn by experiment rather than by an unconscious flow of wisdom. By experiment, it's something that you can prove to yourself. It is known that all healing work is done It is the essence of the energy that rises up the spine and into the cranium, that activates all of the organs of inner world perception, that all seership, all magic, all creative work is a consequence of the sexual energy. And this, when I say sexual energy, I just don't mean energy like that comes off of a match or something like that. That's energy, yes. It's called a fire by some people. It's called a kundalini fire. But it is something that has more character than that. The word that the psychologists use show the psychological side, but not necessarily the energy side, except that they say that it does vivify all complexes. The word that they use is libido. That is the spiritual drive behind things. Like it said that people who are highly spiritual are also highly sexed, because they have learned how to draw on that core within themselves and how to vivify it. Okay. The way they did this is that when those of us who chose to work into feminine bodies, the types of work that we did in feminine bodies was that work was much more imaginative, pictorial, and receptive. And as we were beginning to focus more into the external world, the female body was more receptive yet to inner work. And what they did is they insinuated themselves, or you might say interpenetrated, and almost like inductively put themselves into the consciousness of humans in feminine bodies. This is why, unfortunately, people who identify and say that person is a woman or that person is a man, it's unfortunate, because the spirit can be either. It doesn't make any difference, and it usually is. Sometimes male, sometimes female. But they worked into the spinal energy and brought pictures to the internal consciousness that people recognized that the inner light was dimming. And with the Lucifer spirits focusing inward, there was a brightness given. This is why Lucifers are often called the false light. And in this light, they were able to project pictures, saying you're losing your light and you're coming more and more into bodies that deteriorate. And if you want to be immortal, we will show you how to use this spinal fire at will, so that you will be free, and when you are free, then you will be immortal, because you will be able to create bodies whenever you want. And this is basically what they did. They left out, like all good salespeople, they left out a few important details, and that is how things worked. So they made us aware of the sexual energy and of the sensation thereof, because we didn't have a whole lot of sensation. We're going to talk the next time we get together about sensation a lot, but it was important for us to have sensation. And in the same way that we can instinctively know that something is good for us, that we have cravings for things that are important to our health and being, we knew that sensation was good for us. And in the sexual coupling, there was the first external awareness of someone outside of ourselves, and that was a sensational thing. And that was, in a way, it was good. This is why, it's called, to this day, it's called carnal knowledge. It said Adam knew Eve and she bore Seth. That is to say that the knew, or the knowing, it was the only time that externally we knew that somebody was there. It's a very curious thing now that for some people it's just the opposite. In the times that we live in now, sometimes the only time somebody knows that there's somebody inside is in a sexual experience, but unfortunately they haven't realized how to get to that the other way. So they taught us to, I wouldn't say cooperate, but they taught us complicity. And in that complicity, we became independent. But in so doing, we were disobedient. We were told, almost as little children are told, not to focus their attention on their sexuality. In fact, that's usually done wrong. It's done in such a way that it draws the attention to it all the more. But we went against that because, you see, the divine plan is if it's guided by angels, everything comes out harmoniously. Everything flows. And one learns when to use it, how to use it in such a way that the experience and the meaning of the experience come side by side. That isn't what happened with us, though. So we learn how to create bodies not in harmony with the cosmos. And the result is we learned pain and suffering. It's not to say that pain and suffering are bad. We're going to also look at that the next time we get together. But we produced things that stood out from nature. They were not harmonious to nature. This stands to this day yet. If you look, you're going to go out on any weed patch, and that weed patch looks beautiful because there's a harmony there. Everything is working together. And then you look at the human implements within that, especially if there's a lot of pollution or a lot of devices that are ugly. You can see that our adharmony, our human so-called creations, well, they really are creations, stand out. They're not harmonious with everything else that is going on. We certainly don't have, at this point yet, appropriate or organic creations that fit in with the rest of the cosmos. So that's what the thing was. This was called the fall, and we'll look at why it was called the fall in just a minute. The fall, or the sin means nothing more than adharmony. It means a voluntary going against the grain, working outside of the purpose of the cosmos. To some extent, it's impossible to completely get outside because we are in it, we are it. So that eventually everything that is now called sinful must be redeemed and must be brought back into the greater harmony again. But it is, for the time being, called sin. But the sin is not sexuality. The sin is selfishness. It is that we selfishly chose to use the creative power outside of harmony. We separated ourselves. We selfishly, for our own power, sought out knowledge, carnal knowledge, which was both sensationally pleasant and, above all, sensationally intense. Because the intensity is what made the experience of the external world lively enough so that it could be scooped off and harvested. Again, the same way that it was perpetrated is the same way that it is experienced. The Lucifers, by actually interpenetrating us, can draw off certain kinds of knowledge and experience from our experience in the same way that they egged us into it in the first place. But you got to remember that this is the beginning. This is like the first murder of first murder of Macbeth. There are many, many things that come after this. We fall deeper and deeper and deeper into one kind of sin after another. So it was an ignorant, defiant use of things outside of harmony. And in effect, it was choosing action and experience over the purpose of action and experience. That is, we do things not to fulfill the purpose of, like right now we're doing all kinds of horrid things. Like I tend to think that, for example, we've done terrible, do you mind a little side trip? I'll just try to give some examples along the way. We've done terrible things to the plants. We've not let them evolve. Like the apple trees are not evolving because we keep cloning the same apple trees over again and again. And all of their co-evolutionists, all of the diseases and the insects and things like that, they're evolving, but the apple trees aren't. Because we're not strengthening them and we're not letting new varieties come out because we're selfish. They want to hang on to this apple tree forever and ever. But now that we're getting to the manipulation of form in the way that the life enters into the form, which is called genetic manipulation, we could very much allow this evolution to take place at a rapid pace. And we could allow with the lack of experience that the animal and plant kingdoms have been having, we could allow them to catch up really quickly. But we're doing the same selfish thing. We're trying to make, instead of helping the plants for their purposes, we're trying to make greater profits. And we're trying to make it more, we're trying to manipulate the life forces for selfish ends rather than unselfishly working for the purpose. And so this produces an ironic condition, going all the way back to Lemuria again, when we took the action of making bodies and we reveled in the action in the same way that the Lucifers reveled in the warmth and the heat of the old solar mass in the moon period. When we do that, we choose experience over meaning. And that's what puts us in the place that we're at now. We have to experience something again and again and again until we figure out what it means. We make the same dumb mistakes over again and again. See, we broke up a harmony. If we hadn't broken up that harmony, we would have an intuitive, insightful, spiritual seeing that would go along at the same time that we would have knowledge. And we would experience something and know the meaning of it at the same time, which would lead more to a wisdom rather than a stored up kind of separative knowledge that we have now. Is that a question? Yes. Yes.
How come seeing the purpose in something is sensation?
Oh, it is. But it's a different kind of sensation. Certainly, it's every bit as pleasant, if not more pleasant, to have an intuitive experience than to have just merely a sensual experience. It's just what we chose to do. And we chose an imbalance. But I agree with you that, from my experience, it's probably more pleasant to have an inward experience rather than an outward sensation. But when you're losing light and somebody tells you, well, I can give you something that's better than that, I can give you sensation, and just take a look at it. Most people in the world don't agree with us. This classroom isn't filled up with hundreds of people saying, I want that intuitive experience. But you go to, like the singles bars or places like that where people are looking only. I'm not going to say that that's all bad, or I'm not going to, because I'm talking about dark subjects doesn't mean I'm going to be preaching hellfire and sin and all of that kind of stuff. But there are certainly a lot of people out there that are seeking sensation much more than they're seeking the meaning of sensation. In fact, to some extent, they're so out of touch with the understanding with the being that understands the meaning of things, they don't even think there is a meaning to things. And they can't even experience sensory things in such a way that there is a religious saying how wonderful this is, appreciation of it all. because there's just, like it's all me. Let me experience this pleasure. Okay, so that's what it is. It's a ad harmony. So the consequences of all of this is that, ironically, we got just the opposite of what we want. There are a number of consequences that came out of this. See, basically what we did is we jumped the gun. We wanted things too quickly. But the net consequence of it is that now it takes longer. Because we were impatient and pushed forward, we put ourselves in a much more tedious kind of situation where it takes much longer. It's very, very ironic. It's almost like saying that because we were too anxious in the first place and we were too precipitant in the first place, now we have to wait, and we have that kind of insecurity about things. Another consequence of all of this is why it is called the fall. You could say that every time we came deeper into matter, it was the fall. In fact, if you look at some of the very early cosmological things where the early seers described all of this, like if you take the Chaldeans, if you take like the Chaldean book of Numbers and some of their cosmological things, they talk about each time we go deeper into matter, they call that a fall. This is called a fall with a capital F because we fell into matter deeper than was intended. And even though we were trying to avoid the loss of light, we in fact caused a greater loss of light by going into matter more deeply, so that we're now deeply entwined in the physical. It says we feared death. And instead of being able to accomplish things like when we were naming the animals by a magical spiritual ability, we actually have to do some things physically now. This is why part of the so-called curse when we were cast out of the Garden of Eden was that we'd have to do things by the sweat of our brow, because we couldn't do it by a creative spiritual ability. And so not only that, we actually cause matter to become more hardened than it was intended to be in the first place. Because you remember, as we've been saying all along, that we, in the earth period, as we are becoming self-conscious beings, we are the ones through whom the archetype of the cosmos is brought about. And therefore, when we became overly fascinated with matter and took sensation over intuitive meaning, we took experience over insight, that we actually caused the matter to become harder and more dense, and we caused what some people now call the great illusion. The illusion that when we are focused only in the material world, in the outer world, and we can't see through it to the inner spiritual world, we think that this is all there is, and that this is the true nature of reality, when it is the part of reality that has the most limitation, and it certainly has the most illusion about it, because as beautiful as the human body is, it doesn't always tell us a whole lot about the spirit that is on the inside. And so that's one of the sets of consequences. Everything became hardened, and instead of having a balance between pain and pleasure, we learn everything by pain. Even all of the way our eyes have developed in terms of evolution, even the pleasant touch is really a form of pain. And it's a consequence of external impact. This is why, like, people who become extremely sensitive, like if you take like Nikola Tesla, who developed all of these remarkable spiritual abilities, he became so sensitive that in being in this kind of body, post-fall body, he had to work with the external perceptions as they are. He was so sensitive that he could hear a fly land on the table. And he often, like Beethoven, had to cover his ears up with pillows or things like that to mute the experience. So like when one is becoming inwardly aware, one becomes very much aware of how painful or how much of the experience of the external world is by pain. And part of the pain is not only just the fact that we're in the external world and that we do everything through the vehicle of pain, but because we're working against the grain. Or as Hamlet says, there's the rub. We do things by friction instead of by harmony. And that, again, it goes right back, and friction produces all that old heat, and it causes the same kind of impacts that got us into this in the first place. Okay. Other things that have happened is we put ourselves into a cosmic quarantine. We exiled ourselves from the spiritual world, and one of the consequences of this is that we shut ourselves off from the union that we had not only with our fellow humans, but with all of the gods. And this produced a loneliness. So you might say that we went from a state of being universal to being a pair, and complicitously in that paired action, we became standalone individuals. And in this personal individualism, we became extremely lonely, and it caused us now to turn inward. One of the consequences of this is we have to make up for the errors that we made. We've put things out of time. Now we have to, it's up to us. It's our responsibility to reharmonize, which means that what we have slowed down too much, we must now raise to a higher pitch, which means a much greater effort has to be done. And the part of the psychology of that is by isolating ourselves into personal existence, that produces loneliness, and that loneliness is a very strong motivator to cause us to go forward and cause us to go inward all the more. So we have produced an addiction to passion. We've produced an addiction to sensualism, to sensory experience, to knowledge, to all of those sorts of things. All right, the consequences of it are that we see that we've produced, like the disobedience of Adam and Eve produced the destructiveness of Cain over Abel. And after that, all of the ignorance, all of the mass suffering, all of that has come into the world has come about. Some of the problems with all of this are that this can go overboard, and it can produce a tangential expulsion. Now we have to talk about the really dark things. When we look through our eyes, we're actually seeing things upside down because they're a lens. And it's an experiment you can try if you've got the time to do it. If you wear another pair of glasses that reinverts another time, for a few hours, everything will look upside down. After a while, you, the internal intelligence, will make a correction, and even with those inverting lenses, you'll see things right side up again. But then when you take the inverting lenses off, then you'll see the world upside down again, which is exactly, you're seeing reality as it's coming in through the eyes until the intelligence adjusts again and then sees things what we call right side up. This is a principle of inversion. The things in the external world we see them backwards. We see the form instead of the meaning. And we can get everything upside down and backwards. And this can become a psychological inversion as well. If we discover our personal existence and the divinity inherent in it, and identify it with the inverted materiality, with the inverted attitude of rebellion, it is possible to become a being who sees divinity in standing against the spirit. And this is what results not in straggling, but it results in failure. This results in a being that does everything, that takes all of its energy from all of the experiences of evolution and pits them against the purpose of the evolution. We're talking about something extremely dire. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. It's a stupid thing because ultimately one ejects oneself from evolution and goes back to the pure spirit where it must wait for another kind of evolution to again participate in a grand creative work. But it is possible to do this. These are indeed failures. And remember when we talked, I believe it was the last time that we talked about the moon being thrown off from the earth. Now that isn't just something that happens by accident. What happened was, when we had knowledge of good and evil, and we knew about the creation of bodies, we also knew about the destruction of bodies. And when we became independent, it became to be everyone for self. We also knew that this same energy could be used magically. And instead of creating forms, we could destroy them. And in the early stages of the fall, a number of beings did associate themselves so hard with matter, and the initial picture that they got was inverted. And they became horrible, malignant beings of magic, such that they completely unfitted themselves to go on with evolution. And these are the beings that are associated with the stuff of our moon. And this is, we'll see the next time that we talk, this is why the moon is associated with hardening form, whereas the sun is associated with vital light. That when the moon forces are off at a certain distance, like everything that happens in the uterus is controlled by the moon. It's the whole period, the building of bodies, the production of form is a lunar process. And this is a divine, positive use of what is really a very malignant abuse by some of the early Lemurians that unfitted themselves by doing horribly destructive magical activities to try and advance themselves by pushing others back. And it's one of the things that happens with an inversion. It was obviously done by theft, by the theft of sexual energy, which is the way almost all magic is done. You vampirize sexual energy from other people and use it that way. And it led to a consequence of where the mind was used as an alibi or as an excuse. You see remember, this is still called, from when we had the creative word yet, when we were naming the animals, this is still called the Adam's apple. From when the sexual energy was split between the generative organs, the voice box, and the brain. Only at that time the brain wasn't developed yet. It was all went into the voice box, and we drew in the images from the cosmos, and we just spoke them out. It's clear to see that the sin against the Holy Spirit, the head of the angels is called Jehovah, the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost, who is in charge of the angels and the whole procreative work. We can see that the original sin, which, because we started the dominoes falling. You know what the idea of original sin is. It's the idea that we're born in sin and there's nothing we can do with it, and it's only by grace and by that we can attain to salvation and be freed from sin. But the idea is that we're born from sin, and that was an original sin that started with Adam and Eve. And from a spiritual point of view, that is true. But we were Adam and Eve. We were in those bodies, and this is not something that happened. It's not a one-shot instance. We're talking about something that took place over thousands and thousands of years. It wasn't like a quickie kind of thing. But if you look in the New Testament, the sin against the Holy Ghost is described very clearly in the Gospel of Matthew as lying. Again, forming words, using words destructively, perverting the same sexual energy. It's just that it's used at the other end of the spine, except that some of the beings jumped the gun even further and did it to destroy other people. Now, this is not something that is finished. This is the talk, if Ron were here as he was earlier in the class, he can't drive that far. It's a long way to drive every week. The process of the Lucifers harvesting us is still going on. And every time we allow ourselves to enter either into Luciferic passion or into satanic delay, one or the other, we're perpetuating it. We have an askew view of the cosmos. And it isn't until we harmonize the spiritual and personal selves so that we again reestablish a balanced outlook, this is going to continue. And so all of these, sex and violence that we see on television, all of the sales of things for personal glamour, all of those things are continuations of that same thing. I would even go so far as to say that most of the UFO phenomena are the same thing, that the Lucifers and the beings associated with them recognize that the times are coming again when people are going to be clairvoyant, and they want them to be clairvoyant just a little bit off. They want them to be materialistically clairvoyant. And so that's why they influence people as UFO kinds of beings, because then when people start having an initial experience again, they hope to deflect that initial experience and that way keep an influence over humanity so that they can perpetuate their own evolution. Okay, we've looked at quite a bit of this here. Because of all of this, I guess we're isolated, we're lonely, we're solipsistic, we're harder, we have a harder time to go with it all. But I can't talk about something like this without talking about some of the positives that come out of it, because it would be utterly degradatory to do that, because we'd all walk off feeling really terrible about ourselves. And so I have a basic list of positives, of things that are true goods that will come out of this. Number one, blind faith. That is, we will be able, at some time in our career, before we see, and after we have had material skepticism, we will be left with darkness, sort of a doom attitude of materialism. And the thing that we can develop out of that is the period of history that we are now living in, is a time where we develop blind faith. Even though we have all of this skepticism and we have no evidence, we can develop a kind of faith that is so pure that we can believe. To see God, you must believe that God is, I think is the way the Bible says it. And this is a thing that is very beautiful that we can now develop. Even if we only just take it as a logical idea that there might be a God, or that there seems to be something to this, and have a faith in the dark. That is something that develops us in a unique way because it allows us our individuality, and in a very rare way we appreciate the most important thing, the divine, in the cosmos, with completely isolated from any evidence. All right. A second thing is knowledge. Truly knowing what is good and what is evil. When we do suffer, and when we do see the consequences of our deeds, and we do wake up to it, we have a knowledge that is extremely rare. We know what this results in. We know the consequences of selfish behavior, and we can live out of love. We can live out of unselfishness, which is a much better state. I'm not saying that we should have sinned, but we produce some qualities that would never have been possible if we had never fallen. We never would have had a blind faith. We never would have been without the light. And we never would have had a knowledge, nor would we have a virtue, which is an experiential understanding of good and evil. And from that kind of suffering, we will also never have the humility of having gone against something and then having it brought to our attention. And when someone has a humble obedience rather than a blind obedience, or I don't want to use the word blind there, rather than an undoubtable believing or obedience, they're much better off. You know what I mean? If you've been humbled from all of your human pride and are then obedient because you wish to, it's a much better thing. Yes?
Well, Mrs. Patty, this sounds like that's purposeful.
Yes. What we're saying is that even though we have stumbled, and even though it's going to cost some their participation in the rest of the whole creation, it is a very positive thing. It wasn't the intended purpose. The option was there. We took the option of going against things, and there are wonderful things that come out of it. Another thing that comes out of it is an even more enormous amount of soul power. Because we've made things harder, and we've gone into them more. What we will garner out of the sensory experiences and by applying our will in interacting with this stuff, it's like walking through water. There's much more friction. Because of having gone as deeply into matter as we have, the amount of soul power that will come out of here, it's like there's a law of compensation. Fewer of us are going to make it through the whole creation. We don't even know. It might not be you or I. It's still possible to be caught in our vanities yet. But those that do make it will be exceedingly powerful, glorious, creative types of beings with a humility. Also, we will have what we're going to talk about next time, a very unique kind of brain-mind consciousness that no other being in the cosmos that we know of has because of having this type of experience. And we'll also have within ourselves, because we have separated the personality from the spiritual individuality, we will have not just a flow, that a seamless flow the way the angels did, we'll have this tremendous dialogue between the personal self and the spiritual self. And this dialogue and this ability to create things and to perpetuate the creativity that we have bought at great pain will take us very, we can speculate and we can make creations that were potentially there, but not necessarily within the plan. And this dialogue is quite a wonderful thing. Also, objectivity. When we can look at something from only one point of view, it's strange, this is one of the ironies of it, that the great illusion that we have in matter of this being all there is and not even being able to see the other side and not even to know the whole reality of that chair, for example, this kind of illusion and this very great limitation gives us an objectivity that when we expand it to our total consciousness will give us a really strong sense of objectivity, unlike anything else in the cosmos. And obviously, compassion. From having suffered and suffered and suffered, we won't just have a pure love for everything the way the gods do. We will have a love that has an understanding that comes from having gone against it and knowing, and when you suffer through something with other beings, like we're going to have a tremendous compassion for the plants and animals when we pay back to them, when we once realize, oh my God, what have I done? Almost like Oedipus, when he realized, what have I done? When we once understand that, it's going to result in a tremendous, tremendous understanding that is, again, very unique in the cosmos. A final thing, or another thing, is self-reliance. We will indeed be creative beings that can stand and stand alone. We won't be automatons. We won't be carried along by a sweep of the divine mind the way the angels did, but we will do it self-consciously. We will agree, and self-reliantly we will be able to agree. See, because when you're self-reliant, then you can create all by yourself, and that's, then you don't have to have the gods overlooking you. So it's a wonderful place that we're in. And finally, freedom. Again, it's ironic, from having given up so much of our freedom and being locked into matter where all the laws of matter lead us one way and another, and being so imprisoned by our own misdeeds, the consequence of it is freedom. We had the freedom to sin, and we did. And ultimately, so when we knocked that first domino over, we produced some very, very unpleasant things for the cosmos. But in that same beginning, there were also some very great positives. Next time we'll talk a little bit more about some of the positives and some ideas of good versus not so much talking about evil. I get all excited about this because obviously those of us who need knowledgeable explanations can see the value of the Lucifers, and just as long as we don't overvalue them and get caught in their ways. That's it.